So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining in today. This topic is near and dear to my heart because it's something that I really struggle with as well. Personally, I think emotions are one of the hardest things to deal with in conflict. I've got a lot of content for you to go over with you today. At the end, I'm going to talk more about what working with me looks like and how coaching and mediation can support you in dealing with your emotions. As always, before I get started, just a couple of things I'd like to mention. First, I'd like to acknowledge the land I'm speaking to you from today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. The area now known as Toronto, the city skyline displayed on the screen now, is covered by Treaty 13, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which bound inhabitants to share the territory and protect the land. And as a settler, I try to strive in sharing this promise. I also always like to start with an acknowledgement of how prevalent that white Western influence is in psychology, and this is going to show up a lot today. There's a few people's work that I'm going to be referencing, and while there are more female voices in the conversation, they are still white Westerners. And emotions are not a white Western concept. Everyone experiences them. Different cultures have different ways they're integrated, demonstrated, and even defined. You see this often where there's an emotional concept in English that doesn't translate in another language or culture, and concepts found in others aren't necessarily something we identify in English. Even the ideas that there are universal emotions or universal facial expressions, those are Western concepts. So again, a lot of what I'll be talking about here today does come from that white Western background. So if something's not resonating for you, I respect that. And as always, please take what's useful for you. I also want to acknowledge that emotions are a deeply personal experience. And I'm going to be talking about things that you can do, but this is not to say that it's a you problem. Your emotional reactions may be in response to systemic issues in your workplace. Whatever emotional experience you're having is valid, and it may not be something that you're solely responsible for addressing. Like if there's bad behaviors, that's BAHD, bullying, abuse, harassment, or discrimination happening in your workplace, of course emotions are going to be involved, and you might need support outside of emotional work, like legal support. If you're struggling with conflict right now, especially an emotional one, I might make some of this sound easy today, and I know that it's not, especially when you're in the moment. So my hope today, as always, is to give you some strategies you can use, but just know that there is support available. If you're struggling with conflict, or if you tried some of these things and they haven't worked, it does not mean that you're bad at this. These can be really difficult, and I think it's a practice that we all struggle with to some extent. So I really encourage you to keep trying, and that also might be with support. I'm actually going to talk about working with me in coaching. I've got 5 spots that I'm opening up just because I have another project related to managing emotions in the workplace that I'm going to be working on coming up. I'm going to talk more about that at the end. So here's what I thought would be helpful for us to go over today. I'll start with some background information on emotions. It's a little bit of content we've covered before, but I still think it's helpful to have a foundation. I'm going to talk about integrating emotions and one component in the workplace that needs to be present. And at the end, I'm going to talk more about working with a coach or mediator like me and how that can help you manage emotional reactions. This really isn't something you have to go through alone. At the end, I'm going to try to leave room for Q&A, but anything I don't or can't answer today, I'll go and find the info for you and pop it in the newsletter. So let's just rip the Band-Aid off. Conflict is inevitable, especially in the workplace. We spend a lot of time there with people that have different personalities, working styles, communication styles, different needs, goals, priorities, and life experiences. We are going to get into situations where we don't agree. And I know it can be really hard, but avoiding conflict is likely to lead to that buildup of stress and emotions. Ignoring emotions doesn't make them go away. It might actually have the opposite effect, where they come out unexpectedly and not necessarily constructively. And I'm sorry to tell you, I don't have a magic wand to teach you how to make emotions go away. And that's not necessarily constructive either. Emotions are an important part of our human experience. They give us information. To be honest, in my opinion, I think we're going a little too far in the opposite direction of trying to be calm all the time or not having emotions. Also, in my opinion, figuring out how to work with your emotions is a very learnable thing to do. And it starts with just having an awareness of them. What's coming up? What might be some reasons for that? You already have those answers inside of you. It might just take a little support, resourcing, and practice to bring them out. That's one of the things we do in coaching. So my hope, as always, is to give you some of that info today. And I don't say this as much as I probably should, but it really is to encourage you to work with me on this kind of thing. Emotional work really benefits from a slowing down and a process-driven, objective approach in a non-judgmental space. We can get really caught up in our emotions, and having someone to talk them through with can be an effective tool in figuring out what they mean, why they're coming up, and then to make choices around what to do instead. And don't get me wrong, it's great to talk to a friend. They're probably just going to agree with everything you say or even encourage you, and that might escalate the emotions. And talking to a coworker can be problematic depending on the situation. So don't worry, I have a ton of content for you before I go over how to work with me. I'm going to start pretty theoretical here and with the biological basis. I'm going to get to more workplace focus closer to the end. Just about me before we get started, I mentioned this a little earlier, that emotional overwhelm is something that I deal with myself. What's the saying? You teach what you need to learn, or something like that. Well, this has been a long-term work in progress for me, because we don't all experience emotions in the same way. Some experience them more strongly than others. This comes up in a lot in neurodiversity, sometimes as a trauma response. I'm going to talk more about those two things in an upcoming section, but I want to highlight here, we don't choose our emotions or the intensity to which we experience them. We can choose our behavioral responses. And let me just say that when I use the word choose or choice, it does mean that we have autonomy. It doesn't mean by any stretch that this is easy. One of the things that I work on personally and find helpful is to try to be prepared, because we're not always going to remember this stuff in the moment, especially when it's a stressful one. It's kind of like trying to have willpower. Sometimes there's just going to be too much in the way of that in the moment. So I am a certified workplace mediator and trainer. I'm a conflict coach and an HR consultant. And so I help employees and organizations reduce the time, cost, and stress associated with destructive workplace conflicts. My background's also in mental health, and I do a lot of neuroscience research. I recently did a micromasters in psychological neuroscience. And so a bunch of the content today is from my thesis on the emotions of conflict resolution. Ultimately, my goal is to help support people as they go through these difficult situations, whether that's through teaching, coaching, or actually there with them as a mediator, because I know what it's like to go through workplace conflict and how damaging it can be for your emotional, mental, your physical health. What a struggle it is when you're trying to deal with it by yourself. So let's start with a definition here. Or actually, I should say a lack of a definition. There's currently no clear, accepted technical definition of emotion in the scientific literature. And if we can't define it, well, then we certainly can't have an accurate measurement of it. Does that matter? Maybe not if you're not running an experiment, but I think it speaks to the fact that we're really using our own understanding of emotions and that they are a deeply personal experience based on our physiology, our childhood experiences, and how we've been taught to understand them. This is before we even add on our adult experiences and our other language or capabilities to describe our emotions. Martha Nussbaum's got a great quote here, and she makes an important connection with how emotions impact our behavior. And so the understanding of any single emotion is incomplete unless its narrative history is grasped and studied for the light it sheds on the present response. So we've got to understand both the current and historical context of the emotional experience. I apologize that, I mentioned I'm in a co-working space. I've got a little background noise here today. So I'm going to give you a pretty technical definition from a neuroscience and author, Antonio Damasio. He considered emotions a patterned collection of chemical and neural responses that is produced by the brain when it detects the presence of an emotionally competent stimulus, so an object or a situation, for example. Damasio also provided a thorough definition of feelings compared to emotions. Feelings are the mental representations of the physiological changes that characterize emotions. And in the same article, he also talked about the subjective nature of feelings. They're being private, hidden from outside viewers, and can be difficult to analyze. He believed that these characteristics were projected onto emotions, so they're also seen to be subjective, private, hidden, and difficult to make meaning of. And so a lot of the time, feelings and emotions are used interchangeably, even in some dictionary definitions, like they're used in each other's definitions. So emotions are feelings and feelings are emotions, which to me is just not particularly useful. So for our purposes, I think it's important to distinguish between them for the reason that one is almost always a reactionary response that we don't really have control over, and the other is bringing in the story around this. So how you define these concepts is totally up to you, but for our purposes today, I'll be talking more about emotions as that physiological response and feelings as the cognitive interpretation of the response. Is that making sense? Let me do a quick question check-in here. Anything coming up in the chat? Gonna give that a second. Okay, let's keep going. And while we're on the subject of emotions and feelings, I wanted to bring in a diagram from CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. You might have seen this before. It's called the cognitive triangle, and it's showing the process relationship between our thoughts, emotions, and behavior with the potential impact of a precipitating event or a situation, like something's happened. This diagram actually used to be linear. So with the situation preceding the thoughts, which led to emotions, which led to behavior. And more recently, we're now seeing the arrows go in both directions. So any of these three things can impact the other, and the situation can also be the starting point for any of them. And I think it's important to note that there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing going on here, like which came first? Typically, you'll hear it as the emotions coming first, as that's the physiological response and what's being signaled in the brain. What I think is important here is the interrelationship between all three of these components. And I'm going to talk about more of that next in the context of our fear responses. So fear is one of the main emotional responses that come up in conflict. And that's because that's a threat response. It's one of our oldest brain functions because it's directly related to our survival. And the same goes for almost all animals and organisms. The responses we see in interpersonal conflict are very much similar to our evolutionary responses that encourage behavior appropriate to the situation to ensure survival. These are the fight, flight, freeze, or please, or fawn or fold responses. To be honest, I should probably be referring to these more as reactions than responses. We typically use the word reaction to imply that it's not really a conscious choice that we're making, whereas choosing to respond is the conscious choice. So I'm just going to stick with the current terms on this one. So the fight response is the one that we would use if we've got the potential to win and no other options are available. The flight response, where if there is an escape route available, we're more likely to take it. The freeze response is where we basically become immobile, like staying as still as possible to avoid being seen, or in some cases where our systems are just shutting down or functioning for protection. And then the please response, or the fawn response, that's a newer addition to the stress response written about by Pete Walker. And I believe this came out of his work on complex PTSD, where the person enters more of a codependent state to ensure safety by merging with the needs of others. Just a quick side point on codependency here. It seems to come up a lot these days, and I think there's a relationship with our Western hyper-individualism. There's nothing wrong with wanting to meet someone's needs, especially if we're in a relationship. But as a stress response, we're talking about this being to the extreme and to ensure safety. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. There is some more context here with all four responses, where different responses are used depending on the environment and not necessarily the stimulus. So these stress responses are particularly problematic in conflict because none of these options are particularly conducive to resolution. Fighting brings us to a win-lose mentality. Flight means the situation will not be resolved at the time and could impact the other person's willingness to return to the resolution later. Freeze doesn't allow us to handle the situation at all. And fawn almost always ensures that we will not get our own needs met, potentially leading to resentment and further conflict. It's only when we can move past these initial responses that we're able to better assess the situation and how we want to and are able to move forward. So how do we do that? I'm going to come back to more of the how-to shortly. let's move to a little bit of neuroscience. How does the stress response even come out in the first place? So I'm going for just a basic overview here. Oh, I see a question coming in. I'm going to grab that. I know, Norma, I'm so sorry. I don't, you know what? I'm on a microphone and it should be, hang on, give me 2 seconds here. I'm going to try something. Just going to make this up. Sorry about that, everyone. The two people that were just chatting beside my door have left, so we should be fine for a little bit. Okay, so where were we? Okay, so I'm doing a super basic overview of the neuroscience here. There's a little bit extra on the slides that I'm not going to cover. I just want to highlight a couple of things. And before I do, so this is a collection of info from a number of different researchers at different time points. A lot of neuroscience is just the best information that we have at the time. So I'm not going to go so far as to tell you these are facts, and this info could change in the future or be different depending on which study you're looking at. What I do want to highlight is that the brain regions work together and talk to each other. And there is no one area for emotions or one area responsible for a particular emotion. Different brain areas, neurotransmitters, and neuromodulators interact to create these emotional experiences. So I'll start with the amygdala because that's usually the center of the story. And it's not wrong, but it's not necessarily the brain's fear center. It's more of a signaler to other regions that something needs to be paid attention to. There's something novel, ambiguous, or potentially threatening that needs further evaluation. And it's basically asking for help from other areas to figure this out. So the amygdala is talking with the hippocampus, which is almost like the first place that the threat is being assessed. It's involved in more complex information processing, including relational processing. So looking at situations where we might need to engage defense mechanisms. And it's also activated by facial indications. So where we may see emotions on someone's face, in their tone of voice. It's also involved in memory recognition. Amygdala is also talking to the hypothalamus, which is another system connector. That's what signals the pituitary gland to start getting cortisol into the bloodstream. So it's the hypothalamus that's actually setting off the stress response, part of the HPA axis there at the top. The amygdala is also talking with the periaqueductal gray. I'm going to call it the PAG from now on. This area is considered essential for defensive reactions and the most important region that info passes through during that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. It's just not the only structure active. And there's also a cardiovascular impact here. So the activation of the PAG is considered the basis for panic attacks and other unpleasant sensations like fear, anxiety, and danger. So the PAG is actually also implicated in the freeze response because of that involvement in something like anxiety. So now we're moving a little closer to the prefrontal cortex with the anterior cingulate cortex. It's the ACC. So that's thought to be what's responsible for managing uncomfortable emotions. It's also important for social processing, especially considering a person's intentions or their emotions. And then last one I'm going to touch on here is the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. So it's responsible for working memory, including temporary storage, assessment of information to guide behavior, including the processing of emotional stimuli, complex cognitive tasks such as making decisions, learning rules, behavioral flexibility. It's connected to the hippocampus and a number of other areas, but with the hippocampus, the activity between these two areas regulate the learning and memory processes and the stress response. When we're talking about the stress response, when the HPA axis releases hormones to get the body ready to take a protective action, this actually reduces the ability of the PFC to engage in emotional control and our higher cognitive abilities. So one of the other interesting responsibilities of the PFC is to accurately judge other people's dispositions and attitudes towards us or towards others. And it's activated when we're considering whether people we don't know well are trustworthy or when we make moral judgments about them. So you can see how this would be very much involved in conflict. So while we call the PFC the executive function of the brain, it's important to note that it's not always right. It may make rational decisions and process information, but this is based on our prior experience and the quality of information we currently have. So it would be easy to simply say, just bring the PFC online to engage in rational decision-making. However, this is still subjective. The PFC is going to use the info it has, bring more in if it's available, and it's going to fill in gaps itself. People are still going to do this through their own lens. So, it's one of the reasons that data is not always convincing to someone. So again, this is a really, really basic overview. There's a lot more going on. I didn't even touch on things like dopamine or other hormones. So why is the neuroscience important in all of this? I think it's important to understand that this is an evolutionary adaptation that came about for our survival. And to some extent, that's still true. However, we want to take this adaptation and use it in situations where it's actually necessary, like if you had to run from a bear in the woods. And we want to be able to move through it quickly when it's not necessarily useful, like having a difficult conversation with a coworker. And again, I want to highlight that a lot of this is, to some extent out of our control. We're not at a stage where we can just say, come on, prefrontal cortex, need you to step in and help out a little more here. That's not to say that it's all out of our control, though. There are steps we can take to A, slow down this process and buy ourselves some time for the emotional reaction to subside, and B, work on things outside of the situation. So when they do happen, we've got some preparation for potential reactions. So let me give you a couple tools here that you can use for these immediate reactions or physiological emotional reactions when they happen. The first one here comes from Dr. Andrew Huberman. If you want more of the neuroscience, he's got a wonderful podcast that explains it in a pretty easy to understand way. I'm sorry, I am familiar with the term, so maybe it's just easier for me in that sense. I apologize. I'm not trying to be dismissive at all there, but he talks about the physiological sigh as a way to reduce stress or anxiety. So please check with your doctor before attempting something like this if you've got any heart or breathing difficulties. And you know what? He probably didn't come up with this, but he's talked about it a lot. So apologies for not crediting the right person here, but it's 2 deep inhales followed by a long exhale. So that's 2 in the nose and then 1 long exhale through your mouth. So it's consciously controlling your breathing, keeping it slow, and that's basically telling your brain things are safe and that it can relax. Your heart rate may not catch up right away, but doing 2 to 3 repeats of this breath here should help to move you out of arousal. And I personally don't see anything wrong with doing this in a conversation if you feel like you've been activated, but you could always do it somewhere private if you know you've got a conversation coming up. Box breathing is another variation of this. Something else you can try is cold water, unless you've got sensitivity to something like that. Just on your wrist, you can be drinking ice water. You don't have to go right for the cold plunge or shower or to one of those extremes, but it is a way of interrupting looping thoughts. Cold showers have also been shown to produce endorphins, which are basically the feel-good hormones in your brain. So that's another reason why they're helpful here. 2 tiny little changes of your bodies that you can do in the moment are like just a half smile, or just turning up the corners of your mouth a little bit, or opening your hands. This one is a little easier when you're sitting, but basically, instead of hands like face down on your lap, you can just face them up towards the ceiling. It's just more of that opening and open posture. So a little easier when you're sitting, but it's just really subtle shifts in body language that not only signal to your brain that you're doing okay, they signal open body language to the person you're talking to. So big difference from sitting with your arms crossed. Not to say that there's anything wrong with that. That can be very comfortable for you. It signifies more of a closed off. It might signify a closed off body language. Some emotional reactions have a lot of energy around them. So physical exercise, if that's available to you, can be helpful. Even muscle tensing and relaxation, if that's available to you. I would be remiss if I didn't mention mindfulness here. There's all sorts of different kinds of meditation, whether that's for you or not. The part of mindfulness that can be really helpful in these situations is just to take that step back and look at the situation without judgment, just curiosity for what's going on. There's also the separating of the experience. So instead of I'm furious right now, you can move it towards more of a I'm experiencing anger, or I'm noticing that I'm feeling angry. Another one here that comes from bystander training, and that's to use something like a catchphrase. So if you're in a conflict or someone or a situation where an emotional reaction comes up, you can try to have a word or phrase that you can use as your go-to to create some space to process the reaction. It could be like a whoa, stop, or even something funny like bananas. That one might feel inappropriate for your workplace. I totally get that. But like this kind of thing, it's actually something that I've incorporated into team training. So coming up with a word together so everyone knows when things have escalated and it's time to take a minute and address it. Once you've tried an intervention, it can be helpful just to look at the intensity change with some metrics. So assigning a value to the initial state and then to the change state. For example, when I was really mad, I was at a 9, and after cold water, I'm at a 5. In coaching, I might even ask you, what would it take to get to a 1 or a 2 or just a lower number? It can be helpful to put values on these things that are typically abstract. And then you can compare them over time and watch your progression. So last time I had to talk to this person, I was at a 7. This time I was prepared and was at a 3 for emotional reactivity. So I think I said this earlier, but these are, they're all learnable skills, techniques, interventions, whatever you want to call them. There's no shortage of things you can do in these situations. I've got more for you later on today, and there's even more that we do in coaching. So you are not resigned to being emotionally reactive if that's something that you want to work on. But I will tell you, the other thing that can be really helpful in the moment is just having personal support. So something like having a mediator in the room that can work with you on this, give you space to take a moment when you need it, have a private conversation with you on the spot to help you process what's going on, help you refocus back to resolving the conflict when you're ready. I know this isn't always available, but if the conflict has escalated and it's something important in your workplace, mediation is a worthwhile consideration. So why do some people seem to experience more emotions than others? So if you're having an emotional response, this is normal, even if they seem like they're disproportionate to the situation. Some people are more sensitive to emotional stimulus, and some have more intense emotions. There's the study showing that some people feel emotional pain to the same degree that they would physical pain. There's also something called rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is something that may occur in ADHD, where people feel an extreme pain from rejection. Sensitivity might be combined with more impulsivity and sometimes difficulty with effectiveness. And by that, I mean organizing what they need to do to achieve their goals or communicating in a way that gets the message across the way that they intend. And so sensitivity to emotions and impulsive reactions, it's actually something that you see come up in neurodiversity, which is it's a broad term and an umbrella term. So I'm certainly not suggesting this is everyone, but I do want to highlight that there is a biological basis here. These can also show up as a response to trauma, so an adaptive biopsychosocial response as opposed to a genetic one. And I'm going to include experiences of marginalization or racism here as well. So if an emotional reaction is seeming out of proportion to the conflict at hand, it's something to check out. That might be with a trained trauma professional. That, to be honest, is out of my scope. So there may also be a social basis where someone's environment can make it hard to regulate emotions. This can include invalidation or an environment that rewards extreme emotions. Some people just weren't taught how to regulate their emotions. And some people believe that emotions are bad or weak, so they try to avoid them altogether. This is pretty common. It comes back to that Western approach where we might even be conditioned to close down at the first sign of any uncomfortable emotion. Things like anger, fear, grief, injustice, shame, or sadness. We might have learned to shut down to protect ourselves. And so I'm not trying to say at all that all neurodivergent people or those who have experienced trauma are going to be overly emotional or the opposite, shut down. I'm just trying to highlight that emotions are involved in conversations here as well. Not everyone experiences them the same way. And there's both a genetic and an experiential basis for this. So previously, emotions were considered irrational and detrimental to the conflict resolution process. And actually, again, this is a Western bias that emotions are irrational, or in the workplace that they're unprofessional. It's only really in about the last 20 years or so that they've been brought into the conversation. There was actually a time when researchers were unable to come to a conclusion on what place emotion should even have in theories of the mind and behavior. So it used to be negotiations were considered a process by which parties with, put this in quotes, non-matching preferences would jointly decide on how to allocate resources, considering it more of a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity for human interaction. And ideally, that's what we want to get to, is that both gain, or us versus the problem, rather than the me versus you or a win-lose mentality. But we don't typically start there in conflict. So emotion and logic were actually considered two separate functions of the brain. And in the past, I guess about 10 years or so, they're now seen as being more interacting systems, with studies showing emotions affect how we think and solve cognitive tasks. So there's no left brain, right brain distinction, where some people are emotional and some are logical, and it's one or the other. That's a neuroscience myth that has been debunked. Emotions are information about what's important to us, and it's when we can understand and appreciate the emotions of others, while at the same time integrating our own emotional experience, that's when we're going to be able to respond constructively. So there's three basic components of emotional experience. We've got the behavioral, the cognitive, and the physical. Behavioral component can be considered communicative. So it's how the emotional experience is expressed, which can be by verbal or nonverbal behaviors, intentional or unintentional communication, and may be affected by the culture in which we associate or find ourselves. The physical component is our bodily experience. So the way the emotion makes us feel in our body and what makes the experience compelling or real for us. This is also linked to our identity because it requires a sense of self, which is also what makes it compelling and potentially something that leaves a mark, or like our memories. The cognitive component deals with the role of our mind in the emotional experience, including the way we appraise the situation in a way that's relevant to us. So this can be considered what predicts emotions. So for example, challenging emotions arise when we perceive something to be interfering with or blocking our ability to achieve our goals, needs, or expectations, whereas more enjoyable emotions result from achieving our goals or receiving unexpected gains or benefits. We might have attributional tendencies similar to our biases that influence the likelihood whether we skew more positive or negative in the interpretation of our emotions. But while all three of these components are related to how emotions impact conflict, it's our cognitive appraisals that most impact our willingness to address the situation. So if we incorrectly attribute somebody's contribution to the conflict as being destructive, we might have a harder time trying to come to a resolution with them. So just an example, in the workplace, if you think somebody's deliberately trying to sabotage your work, you're likely to be angry, and that's going to impact how you show up in the conflict. If you can try to look for alternative explanations, don't immediately go to a judgment like that, then we're approaching this with curiosity, and it's easier to find ways to move forward. So emotions also motivate action. So action to engage or action to avoid. Accumulated levels of emotions, called emotional energy, these can be what fuel conflicts and how people behave. So these researchers, Bramson and Potter, they call them positive and negative. So I'm going to stick with those names. I normally use constructive or destructive, and not the positive or negative in terms of the subjective judgment there, but we'll stick with them here. Their study found positive emotional energy encouraged collaboration through confidence, trust, and willingness to take action, whereas negative emotional energy represented anger, resentment, and drove more conflictual action. So a loss of emotional energy, that was characterized by feelings like shame and hopelessness, leading to a lower tendency to take action or engage in the conflict. So let me talk about anger here for a second. Even though it's being referred to as part of negative emotional energy, it's important to understand anger as one of our foundational emotions. As an emotional experience, anger lets us know when a boundary has been crossed or when something is important to us. It may also signify a loss. Like sadness is, I would say, is almost always involving a loss, so too might anger. And in conflict, anger can be both a feeling and a tool or a behavior. And so for this reason, it's really important that we check out with ourselves and others what's really driving the anger, separating that from the behavior, which might be something like aggression, and see if that we can move it towards something constructive in the conversation. So if you're finding that anger is coming up for you in a conflict, you can check that out. What have I lost, or what am I losing here? And I don't mean that in a possession sense. It could be one of your values that's being impacted. I'm going to come back to more ways that you can work with anger, but first, there's another two emotions that come up a lot in the context of conflict, and that's guilt and shame. These two emotions are considered significant to regulating moral behavior because they come up in interpersonal situations when some impact has caused the relationship to be threatened. I just saw something the other day actually that was saying that these were backwards, but I'm still going with these definitions with guilt and shame being very separate emotions due to their different orientations. So guilt is in response to a particular action committed, whereas shame is more associated with who we are as a person being seen in a negative light. So it's the difference between what I did and who I am. And so there's a study from 2012 where researchers found that people who feel guilty experience less emotional distress and anxiety and focused more on how their actions impacted the other person, motivating them to try to make the situation better by admitting they had caused harm, apologizing, or engaging in another form of repair. People who felt shame felt more threatened than those who felt guilt due to the perceived negative evaluation from others. And their responses actually vary between aggressive and avoidant. So they found guilt had the potential to strengthen relationships due to the person feeling compelled to take responsibility and making an effort to understand the other person's perspective. Shame, on the other hand, was found to have the opposite effect. So it basically coming down to somebody experiencing guilt will have more of a concern for others, and somebody experiencing shame will have a higher level of concern for self. And so the author suggested that the non-cooperative behaviors used by someone experiencing shame included competition, neglect, avoidance, and obliging, which appear really, really similar to those previously mentioned stress responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So for this reason, we could potentially consider a shame response as more likely to induce that stress response in a way that's not productive in the conflict. And while it's not specifically an emotion, it's a behavioral response that stems from them. So I did want to touch on self-criticism because I think that it perpetuates a negative emotional cycle, and it shows up frequently as a particularly destructive response to conflict. According to the conflict dynamics profile, that's an assessment tool that I use, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end, but it's the most frequently used of the destructive responses to conflict, and is basically a person ruminating about the situation, thinking about things they wish they had said or done, and typically incorporate a negative self-evaluation. This may bring about feelings of helplessness, shame, or anger at oneself for not handling the situation more effectively. And so this self-induced stressful evaluation, it's problematic because it can reinforce an avoidant pattern of dealing with conflict because of those negative emotions that can arise before, during, or after the conflict. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what emotions are, how they come up, how they impact us in conflict, and I'm guessing you're all waiting for the how-to part, which you know I always get to, don't worry. Apparently, I'm not actually supposed to share as much of that in these webinars in the hopes that you'll come to work with me, but that's just not my style. I want you to have some things that you can try on your own, and as much as I recommend having someone to talk through this kind of thing with, that might not be your process, and that's totally fine. I get that. So I've gone through a couple of these things before. I've got a few new ones here too, but the first suggestion for dealing with emotions comes from Martha Nussbaum's work, and that involves accepting emotions as part of the reasoning process itself. It's not separate emotions and logic. So rather than looking at those as being two separate processes that we engage in, we can see how they're intertwined through the various brain regions and impact each other. Lisa Feldman Barrett has a fantastic book called How Emotions Are Made that goes over a lot of this neuroscience as well. So she talks about this too, that emotions are complex systems. Reason does not rule emotion. It's a part of the system and they work together. So the second one here, Nussbaum also discussed how while emotions are complex cognitive structures, they have a narrative form. So we shape our emotional and ethical reality through the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we feel. So her work was again echoed by Barrett, Lisa Feldman Barrett, when she talked about how the words we use impact ourselves and others. And while the content may not be particularly problematic, the way that we talk about it is. So she gives an example using the words anxiety and depression, referring to them as just labels, where there's other words to describe our personal experience, whether that's using terms of arousal or sensation. But I'll give you, I've used this one before, but I'll give you a personal example to illustrate. If I said I was anxious about this presentation, that might actually escalate things and make me feel even worse. If I can put some more detail to it, something like, I'm feeling really nervous about this presentation, I can feel my stomach in knots. So I've got a physical sensation and a story I'm telling myself about it. And if I can add even more specificity and try to look at where the story is coming from, I can start to make some movement there. Getting more specific here is called emotional granularity. Once we're better able to label our experience, this actually even leads to more resiliency. So two resources that are really helpful for this are the feelings and needs list from the NVC website, I've got some older posts on Instagram about this, and I've shared them in the newsletter previously. And then the wheel of emotions is also helpful because it shows some emotions that are similar to each other, so that it can help with determining where you are based on the intensity that you're experiencing. These show up in dialectical behavioral therapy as well. It's DBT. So where, if you have a primary emotion like anger, and then more specific descriptors like annoyance, exasperation, or grumpiness, we've got like there's really different nuances there. This actually can be a really helpful way to deal with anger when you try to add those layers of nuance to it. So if you're feeling angry and you've named that, ask yourself, and what else? And try to come up with 2 additional emotional descriptors of your experience. So that might be, I'm so angry that I've got to work late again tonight. And what else? And maybe you add, I'm frustrated that I've had a hard time communicating with my boss around this. And I'm sad that I'm going to miss family dinner again. So teasing apart those layers can help to bring that intensity level down. And if you're not doing this in conversation with someone, I highly recommend journaling here just to get this, like the internal thought process out of your head. Another technique I find so helpful is using the phrase, the story I'm telling myself is. And that's for 3 reasons. Number 1, it puts some space between the emotion and the narrative, which creates more room for us to respond rather than react. Number 2, it gets us away from, something being a fact. It's reminding ourselves that this is a narrative and this is happening for us, not necessarily a truth. The 3rd reason is that if you use the statement with someone else, like in the conversation, you're not making an accusation about something, you're describing your experience, and that can really help to reduce potential for defensiveness. So if I go back to my example and say, I'm really nervous about the presentation, and the story I'm telling myself is that someone's going to disagree with what I'm saying. So now even just hearing that out loud, I'm likely to think, okay, I can see where this escalated, and I can start to look at the narrative and change it to something else. Like, it's totally fine if someone disagrees with me. Just so when the questions are coming later, that is totally fine. A lot of this information is coming from scientific literature. I'm open to looking at other sources. If someone has one, that's great. I can learn more. If there's challenging feedback, I can try to take it constructively. So yes, this is part of the name it to tame it philosophy, but we want to be conscious of the narrative and the words that we're using so we're better able to understand our experience and by extension, how it may be affecting others, which is critical to conflict resolution. I'm just going to move through a couple of things here. Okay, so naming the emotion, that's what's called implicit emotion regulation, where we're just acknowledging it, not actively trying to change it. The other one is, the last one here, explicit emotion regulation. That's an attempt to reframe or change the emotion. So this might include behavioral or physiological interventions like visualization, breathing exercises, temperature change. Talked about some of those ones earlier. Les Greenberg, one of the founders of emotion-focused therapy, talks about changing emotion with emotion. So that uses a prescribed sequence of emotional states to move towards a resolution. And it basically goes from a dysregulated state where we may not even have a sense of what the emotion is, but we just know that something's off or we're having a challenge with it. And then doing some work to uncover that, moving through some of that emotional granularity to come to a place of understanding and acceptance of the emotional experience. One of the things that they point out is that if there is fear and shame coming up, there's 2 parts underneath those emotions. So there's a core unmet need and a negative evaluation of oneself. So we would separate these things, look at them individually, and try to introduce contradictions to challenge those negative evaluations. Another tool from DBT involves checking the facts. Does your emotional reaction fit the facts of the situation? And there's no judgment here, just curiosity around the experience and if our thoughts and interpretations are impacting our experience. It involves looking at our assumptions, including if we're assuming there's a threat, which is one of the things that can set off our stress response system. Last one here, there's a counterintuitive approach to dealing with emotions. Don't talk about emotions or feelings. Instead, you could talk about your values or what you've lost in the situation. This can be especially helpful in conflict resolution because it points directly to what our needs may be rather than a state that someone may have trouble identifying and articulating. Again, said, not everyone, grew up with an understanding of emotions, having the words for them. So just talking about, what our needs are or what we may have lost, it can also point to what we value and what we might need to ask for. And emotional processing can be overwhelming. So, I encourage you to do what's within your capacity, might be just little bits at a time and with support. I love this quote. I use this all the time, and it's going to lead us nicely to our next section. But a really important tool in dealing with emotions is self-compassion. This is crucial for dealing with difficult emotions like shame and interrupting destructive behaviors like self-criticism. So this quote from Martha Nussbaum is a reminder about this in terms of how we address our needs and them not being met. Self-compassion for our human experience and our needs is critical for incorporating our emotional experience, especially when it's difficult. So I was doing some research the other day for something unrelated, and I had a bit of a light bulb moment. When we're having an emotional reaction, there's a breakdown of trust. So I'm going to move us towards this concept, especially as it relates in the workplace, because if you build a foundation of trust, you get out in front of a lot of conflicts and potential emotional reactions. So this next section, this is our last one here. It's coming from Charles Feltman's work. He's got a book called the Thin Book of Trust, and his definition, I think, is pretty profound. I think Brene Brown's actually referenced this recently. I'm sorry, I meant to put it on the slide here, but I'll add that in when I send out the email about this. So Feltman defines trust as choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to the actions of someone else. Whew, it's a big one. So this isn't necessarily, it's not a yes or no, it's not a one thing or the other. Trust exists on a continuum and it's contextual, different across people or situations. So Feltman talks about it in the workplace where his research and experience has shown time and time again, when there's interpersonal conflict, politics, inability to get things done, or things are staying the same, like they're stagnant, people not caring or having negative attitudes, they are almost always traced back to a breakdown in trust and accompanied by challenging emotions. On the flip side, successful companies or organizations where people are innovative, have constructive conflict and debate ideas or tasks, have fun working together, he usually finds strong, trusting relationships. This is also a fundamental piece of having psychological safety or not. And then on the opposite side of our continuum is distrust. So it's essentially the opposite of trust in that it's a choice not to make yourself vulnerable to another person's actions. It's a general assessment that, what's important to me is not safe with this person in this situation or in any situation. In these kinds of situations, we tend to want to protect ourselves. And if we start protecting ourselves, the strategies we're likely to use are what we would consider destructive behaviors in conflict: avoiding, attacks, withholding, demeaning. These are likely to reduce the other person's trust in us, and the vicious cycle continues. And the conflict either, it gets prolonged or it escalates. So he also found that people typically rate their own trustworthiness higher than others. So keep this in mind. People might be thinking this about you as well. And people are acting on their assessments of how trustworthy you are, not what you think. So here's what he includes as 4 components of trust and what people base their assessments on. Slide here. Great. Sincerity, reliability, competence, and care. So sincerity is, I mean what I say what I mean, and act accordingly. It's really an assessment of our honesty and that our actions line up with our words, and this helps set up future expectations. Reliability is, you can count on me to deliver what I promised, so we follow through with our commitments. Competence, I know I can do this, and I need to learn how to do that. And and it's also that we've done the work of thinking through something and getting evidence. And then the last one here is care. We're in this together. This is the assessment that you've got the other person's interest in mind as well as our own when we make decisions and take actions. And this is the one that's arguably the most important for building lasting trust. And I think there's a recurring theme in these 4 of openness and clarity. These are also really important to building safety through trust. And you'll notice these are all behavior-based criteria. It's not just a sense of the person, but it's a what are they doing that you're assessing. And so one more point on clarity here. People may define these things differently in the same way that they define trust or safety differently. So I'm going to encourage you to reflect on the following and leave you with some maybe this will be nice journal prompts for you. What indicates to you that there's trust in a relationship, specifically a workplace relationship, and you could use this for anyone? How would you respond if someone you work with told you they didn't trust you? What would you ask them in order to understand their specific concerns? Because this one's likely to get an emotional reaction. What behaviors or actions have led to your assessment of distrust with another person? This can be really helpful if you want them to rebuild trust with you, or it may give you a sense of what else you needed in that situation. When you're in a conflict and it's bringing up some challenging emotions, ask yourself, what do I not trust here? If you're familiar with the constructive behaviors in workplace conflict, I've gone over some of these before, you could look at, what would I need to trust to use one of these strategies? One of which might be expressing emotions. And now, I think I said this at the beginning, in no way am I saying that, all of the responsibility, it's not just all on the responsibility of an employee to take on this and, have trust throughout the whole organization. This may be this needs to be a part of organizational culture, and that certainly involves leadership to do. It involves everyone's buy-in with it. So I just want to get across here that if this is missing, it may be going beyond just one person or what you can fix. I just wanted to bring this in as an important consideration because trust is fundamental to our sense of safety, autonomy, and dignity as human beings. It is a critical part of every relationship we have. When we trust someone, we feel safe with them. And that's where, if an emotional reaction comes up, it's likely not going to be as intense, or we're going to be able to handle it in a constructive way. Okay, so let's recap. Emotions signal the presence of events that have potentially major implications for our well-being, specifically important threats and opportunities in the environment, something that would cause somebody to focus on concerns that require immediate attention. So this also involves the thinking process, how we, the story we're attaching to what's happening, how we feel about it. And so put simply, emotions are the physiological response. And whatever elicits the emotional response, that's got to be of importance to the person experiencing the emotion. So this is to say we don't typically get emotional about something we don't care about. So this is really important to our conversation on conflict, because if we're seeing strong emotions, they can be considered markers of what's truly important to someone and should be explored further. Emotions serve social functions. They may not always serve a person in constructive ways, but they're important indicators of what we value, what's important to us, and what we're afraid of. And so since we can't avoid either our emotions or our conflicts, or our emotions in our conflicts, the better we're able to identify, acknowledge, and understand our emotions, the better we're going to be able to use them constructively when the situation demands. So our emotions are a fundamental part of our physiology, embedded in many different interconnected brain regions, neurotransmitter systems. They've evolved to protect us from threats. However, conflict isn't always a threat. It's also a necessary and fundamental part of our human experience. And so for this reason, we need to be able to deal with our emotions in order to be able to handle conflict constructively, because both are central to our existence. So, emotions are pretty intense in conflict, but they're designed to come and go. And so I've given you lots and lots of tools and strategies to use. And I really hope these are going to be useful for you to do some of that flowing through emotions, make it a little easier. And I will say that, working through some of these in coaching, using your specific situation and getting a chance to practice them really goes a long way to making lasting changes. The other thing we're trying to do in mediation and conflict coaching, we're trying to broaden perspectives and help people open up to the possibilities that are available to them or that they can create. When we talked earlier about the stress response, one thing it really does is narrow someone's field of vision. And I mean that in a literal and figurative sense. It's blocking out some outside information so that the person can focus entirely on the situation at hand and getting to safety. So it's my job as a facilitator to help create some of that safety and help the person widen their perspective back out. I'm guessing, some of the tools that I've given you today might sound a little surface level, considering, what we're talking about here. And to some extent, that's true. Not to say that these aren't useful, but in coaching, we're really spending some time on these kinds of things. And I'm asking you questions to help you to think really deeply about them and understand them, work together to change what it is that you want to. Because that's what coaching is really all about. I'm using a proven